This week, we launched our Break the Barriers campaign. Access and education is so difficult in today's world. With the second highest fees in the EU, coupled with spiralling costs of education, and the fact that our SUSI grant supports are just not enough, we need to take action against the government to make sure that we see a change here. So that is why we have been lobbying TDs and senators for weeks on these issues. We have been presenting to the Oireachtas Committee on Education and Skills on SUSI reform, and this week we've been on 20 campuses, which is most important because we've been out on the ground talking to students about these issues and telling them about our national demonstration, which is taking place on the 3rd of October.
Okay, so today I'm joined by USI President Lorna Fitzpatrick. Lorna, thanks for joining me.
Thank you,
Former President of Carlow IT, if I'm correct, now just recently elected into her second term as USI President. In terms, just to name a few of her predecessors in the role, so we have Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore, was formerly President of the USI, Joe Duffy, Councillor Kevin Donoghue, Senator Annie Hoey, and also Laura Harmon, formerly of the NWCI. So obviously, when COVID happened, earlier on, very strict restrictions put in place. As colleges were about to start, a lot of students faced a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of whether they'd be able to find a new place, whether they should be looking for a new place. Obviously, concerns in terms of living arrangements, who they might be living with, social distancing, and so forth. Also faced anyway, even before COVID, with extremely high rents. So what's your take in terms of the current crisis facing students on accommodation, and what's your message, what's your advice to students?
So in terms of the overall picture, I think we are too reliant on the private market. So if we think back to March, the higher education institutions did offer refunds to students. Now, some of them took a little bit longer than others, but they all got there in the end, in terms of offering refunds on university or institutional owned campus accommodation. That's significant. That had to happen. It's just a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. That had to happen. But the problem then was because we're so reliant on the private market, there are so many students who are living in private purpose-built student accommodation or private accommodation because there isn't enough of the institutional owned accommodation. So, and that's where the problem arose then, because those students not the vast majority of those private providers weren't providing refunds. Some of them did, and we did have engagements with them all, and some of them did offer refunds, but not across the board, and there was no way of forcing them to do it, which was a major problem. Minister Harris has recognised that we are too reliant on the private market, which is helpful. That's a step. But I think now we need to see the action to back up those kind of comments and that kind of commentary where we recognise the issue, which is that we're too reliant on the private market. So let's do something about it. Let's build publicly funded and publicly owned university and college owned student accommodation. So that's the broad landscape piece. But in terms of, so then, as you say, people were moving back to college for the new academic year or wondering should they or shouldn't they. And I think that in and of itself was a major issue around the lack of clarity and communication that has been there for students across the board. I think it's different in each institution, but I think it's been questionable across the board and lacking in many places. So I think, so then over the summer, we launched a campaign for emergency provisions for student accommodation to try and prevent a repeat of what we had seen in March. If there was delayed to start dates, or if there was, if the same higher level restrictions came into place and students didn't need that accommodation again, then to make sure that those provisions were there on a legislative basis to support them. We had a meeting with, we've met with Minister Harris and we've discussed this. We've met with Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, on this as well and discussed it. They've both recognised that there is something that needs to happen here, but again, I think it comes back to the point of seeing the action as a result of recognising the problem. So we've contacted them both, again, asking them to do something about it, and to initiate legislation to support student renters. And we will continue to push that through. But I think it is very much an issue around lobbying. We've also engaged with opposition parties on it as well, to try and get some pressure placed within the political sphere on it. But it is extremely difficult. And I think now where we see some institutions are saying that they're going to remain online possibly until the end of the academic, or until the end of this semester, it's really portraying exactly what we said was going to happen, and highlighting again the lack of action and the impact that lack of action will have as a result of government not moving on this.
Okay. Just interesting, and I have to ask.
Just one thing on it as well, that if there's a student who's been affected by this, contact your local TD and put the pressure on them to try and do something about this, because when we met with the Minister, it is very much that there is public law versus contract law, and the students sign into contracts about their accommodation and so on. But we need to try and ensure that there's COVID clauses inserted into all of those contracts, so that if something like this happens, that there is a clause within it that allows them to be able to get out of that contract. And we need to put the pressure on the providers to do that. So contacting TDs and contacting local representatives, I think, is a really really important step in this.
By and large, I think it's fair to say that most colleges, if not all colleges, have services in place for mental health. But I mean, it's come out now that these services are overwhelmed and that there's not enough in terms of mental health supports for all students. So what's your take? What needs to change?
It needs a long-term sustainable funding plan. So as part of that reopening package, USI had been lobbying for a long time around mental health supports, and we launched the first ever National Student Mental Health Strategy, or report, last summer. And then we've been involved in writing national strategies and national frameworks in relation to student mental health and young people's mental health, and they're due to be released in the coming days. And so we were involved in that. We were involved in massive lobbying for funding for counselling and for mental health supports on campuses for students. And so as part of that reopening package, we've seen 5 million being made available for student mental health supports, which was very much welcomed. And it was dedicated towards increasing the number of student counsellors, psychiatric nurses and staff within counselling services, so that they could be really supported and really developed, I suppose, to support students. Because one of the things that we've seen come out of the national report that we launched last summer was that in some cases, like, the waiting lists were shocking. Like, they were really long. In one particular times of the year, they were worse than others. But in some instances, you were waiting up to 12 weeks for a counselling appointment. Like, that's a semester. So that's not something that can be sustainable. So that funding was very much welcomed. It was issued across the board to each of the HEA-funded higher education institutions. But that was a pot of funding. And while we're very much welcoming the pot of funding, we also need to recognise that one pot of money isn't going to solve this problem. We need to have that long-term sustainable core funding that is there to support these services and build these services so that they can support students.
So it seems, just from what I've been hearing, just whether that be in terms of accommodation, online learning, or mental health, that a huge issue facing universities is just funding, full stop. But also just to talk about kind of access to university in general, a big issue facing a lot of students are fees. And so it's a big debate in terms of what should be done about fees. I know it came up in the Dáil recently. But just to kind of mention the Castell's report, the report that came out in 2016, that laid out 3 options. So it was one was to, if I'm not, introduce student loans, and that was ruled out. The second was to keep fees at the same level but increase state funding. And the third, if I'm not mistaken, was just to fully fund higher education and abolish fees. So obviously that was 3 years ago. A new ministry for higher education has been set up since then. What do you think? Why has it taken the politicians this long to act on the report? When do you think something might happen?
So the three options that were outlined, just to say, USI very much is in support of the publicly funded model, which is removing the fees and for the state to actually fund the system, because we see higher education and education on its as a whole as a public good, and so we believe it should be treated as such. And also worth noting that the income contingent loan piece was very much on the table until there was a significant lobbying effort by USI and by students across the island to try and push that off, because the international evidence shows that it has detrimental impacts in terms of access. It doesn't open it up, it actually closes it down, because those particularly from more disadvantaged backgrounds are more debt adverse, and so won't go somewhere if they have to take a loan on to fund it. So there was a significant lobbying effort in relation to that. As you say, it was released 4 years ago now. It was in July 2016, and very little actual action has been taken as a result of it. It was sent off to Europe for a cost analysis, and that's due back soon. And so we've heard this and that and the other. Basically, it was kicked down the road, and the can was kicked down the road in relation to it. And so while that happened, and it relates back to that point I made earlier about the 50% cut in state funding over the last decade per student for higher education institutions, the student numbers have continued to grow. So the college and the size and student numbers have massively increased, but the funding has actually continued to decrease. So those two things just don't match up on a scale, and so action does need to be taken on it, and we do need to see significant investment in education and in higher education.
Now, just to talk about the campaign for fully funded higher education, that's the Education Futures campaign that was formed by a coalition of student organizations and trade unions. So it's great to see that campaign kick off recently. I also know recently that you met with the minister. How's the campaign been? What's the relationship been like with the minister?
Yeah, so the coalition, the Education Futures Coalition, as you say, is made up of trade unions and students' unions. And I think just the first thing to say is that the three pillars of it are around access to education, around decent work, and about quality education. And I think those three things are integral. They need to be side by side. They all feed into one another. And so the campaign's going quite well. We had a webinar over the summer, or over the last little while. I can't actually even remember what date it was, but in the last couple of weeks. And the minister, Minister Harris, attended that and was on the panel in relation to it, and again said some really useful some really useful comments in relation to funding, and recognising the issues around funding, recognising the issues around the student contribution charge and so on. We are waiting on a final report to come back from the Minister's office in relation to all the things that had been addressed at that webinar. So I think that'll be a really useful piece for us to have as a tool moving forward around what the positions are and being able to engage on those a little bit further.
Right, so now just the last topic I want to talk about, just in general, nothing to do with COVID, but it's just the huge amount of inequality that there is in higher education. So obviously there's certain statistics that are out there. So for instance, I mean, if you go to a private school, for instance, you're far more likely to go on to higher education than if you didn't. So if you're from a certain area, say, or from a certain background, you're just simply more likely to go on to higher education than from a different background. So just to talk, for instance, just as an example, about the Trinity Access Programme in Trinity College, this has obviously had impact on hundreds of students in terms of getting into university, and it's worked really well as a scheme. So we have the likes of Senator Lynn Ruane and Gary Gannon TD who've gone through the programme and have been big advocates for education in general, but also for access programmes like TAP. Do you think that these programs are the best way to facilitate access to education? Do you think these are good programs? Should they be extended? What's your take?
Yeah, I think there's an ideal world answer scenario to that as well. So I think in the morning, if we had a properly resourced, fully publicly funded education system, then I think that would play a big part in terms of improving access to education. But I also think that that kind of reform of the Leaving Cert and that CAO and that competitive based system also needs to feed into the part about broadening access as well. So I definitely think that like the Trinity Access Programme and other access programs that are run in institutions across the island are absolutely incredible. And are really make such a massive difference in terms of people's lives. And so I think that is really, they are invaluable in that sense. I definitely think they should be supported and they should be funded and they should be able to help access for as many students as possible. But again, the access is about so much more than just getting in the door of college. It's about being supported to do your best while you're there. So those kind of things in relation to accommodation and SUSI and so on, they all have an impact on people's ability to access education. Because as I say, it's not just getting the points or it's not just being able to afford the fee. It's about being able to actually afford to live and not take up a job that you're working crazy hours to try and support yourself and to actually get through college, you know? So I think if we look at access in that really, in the way in which I think we should be looking at it, which is that broad sense, there are a number of different things that need to be taken into consideration to improve and truly improve access rather than just the numbers in first year cohorts.